This is KSL Sunday Edition with Boyd Matheson.
Welcome to Sunday Edition. I'm Boyd Matheson. You're in for a real treat this morning as we are joined by Mr. George Will, longtime Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post, where he covers politics, domestic and foreign affairs. More than a national treasure, he's a fountain of insight, wisdom, and perspective on the principles and policy that are vital to our constitutional republic. Mr. Will, welcome for the first time to TV side of KSL and Sunday Edition.
Glad to be with you.
Nice to have you in your seersucker from Washington, D.C. And we're going to start today by talking a lot about the Supreme Court, a lot of the big decisions that came down not too long ago. And one of those that came down had to do with the president's student loan forgiveness. You wrote about this extensively in terms of not just what the policy was or the spending, but an important insight in terms of that major questions doctrine. Give us some insight there.
Well, the scale of the spending involved in the loan forgiveness that the president tried to bring off, $430 billion, which would have made it one of the largest domestic programs in U.S. history, is relevant to the major questions doctrine. What the court said was, President Biden purported to find authorization for this in the HEROES Act, which was passed to ease the difficulties of soldiers and others disrupted by 9/11 who had student loans to pay. The president, 20 years later, takes this and says, well, the authorization to modify these loan agreements means I can cancel the loan agreements. The Supreme Court said, not so fast. If Congress wants to do something that large, this is the major question. If there's a major question at issue, Congress ought to say so clearly and explicitly, which of course it did not do in the HEROES Act 20 years ago. This is not the first time, and it will not be the last time that the Supreme Court has said that Congress must step up, act responsibly, take responsibility, and be clear. Some people have said, well, this is the court being imperial. No, it's not. This is the court asking the Congress to be more imperial, asking the Congress to put the executive branch on a short leash. The Article III courts are doing for the first branch of government, the legislature, an assistance in coping with the rampant second branch, the presidency.
Yeah, and it does seem that the court continues to say, Congress, just do your job. We'll deal with the interpretation of that on the back end. Another area where Congress doesn't seem to be doing its job, or seems to be a lot more in the shoulder shrugging versus shoulder squaring, is when it comes to spending. We know the debt continues to rise at exponential rates. Give us some sense in terms of what's happening there and why both the left and the right seem to just shrug their shoulders and continue to spend without any real restraint.
Well, we know what the driver of the structural debts are. They are Social Security and Medicare. We have an aging population. We have 10,000 baby boomers retiring into Social Security and Medicare every day. By the time they've all retired in 2030, the average age of the American population, coast to coast, will be higher than the average age of the population in Florida today, and Florida is justly known as God's antechamber. So the problem is that we have an aging population. We have driving the great spending on entitlements for the elderly. By the way, I'm not against the elderly. I am elderly. I'm older than Joe Biden, which means I'm older than the mountains in Utah. But this is the problem. And during the president's State of the Union address, he said, well, I will not touch Social Security and Medicare. Not only did Democrats jump up and cheer, Republicans jumped up and cheer. And the president was so stunned by this bipartisan nonsense that he says, well, I'm glad to see we're all in agreement. Well, Donald Trump, the leader at the moment for the Republican presidential nomination, says, I wouldn't touch Social Security and Medicare. Ron DeSantis, the fading number 2 at this point, has said, I won't touch them. which means that both parties are more or less formally committed to doing nothing about the most predictable crisis in American history because it's driven by demographics. It's baked in the cake.
Yeah, so interesting. And it is that absolute predictability of consequences that no one in Congress seems to be really interested in. You've really spent a lot of time talking about this whole idea of community and culture leading as opposed to politics shaping things. Where are we in that stance, or are we just simply going to undulate along as a nation, and where does that actually lead us?
The problem is, as you know, you're a veteran of Washington. People know the problems are coming, the problems are intensifying, but they plan to be gone by the time the crisis arrives. Let me tell you a story. Shortly after the Indiana primary in 2016, when Donald Trump secured the nomination for the 2016 nomination, his people brought him back to Washington to be briefed on some issues. They gave Paul Ryan, who's then Speaker of the House and a great expert on budgetary matters, they gave him 20 minutes to brief the nominee Trump. Trump listened for 5 minutes, waved his hands and said, yeah, I got that, but I'll be gone when that happens. That's the problem. No one expects to be here when the crisis occurs.
Yeah, and that is that short-sightedness, that instant gratification seems to be what's really driving all of that today. Real quickly, George, before we take a break, there seems to be this growing space where the center-left to center-right in the country is starting to at least begin to realize that they actually are the majority. The loud left and the noisy right seem to be getting in the way of a lot of that. Where are we in that context, and is there space for that movable middle to actually step forward and move the country?
I think if the Republicans nominate someone who gives this dynamic middle a voice, you're going to see it's going to be like oxygen hitting a spark. There'll be an explosion of gratitude on the part of the country. And I think that's still quite possible. And of course, if they don't, if the political market does not work, that is, doesn't supply what the country is demanding, if the political market instead supplies Biden Trump 2.0, there's no labels waiting in the wings. And they will produce a third-party ticket, and then things will really get interesting.
Yeah. Well, we're going to stay with the conversation and stay with the question here. More of my conversation with Mr. George Will on Sunday Edition next. Welcome back to Sunday Edition here on KSL. I'm Boyd Matheson. We're continuing the conversation with legendary Washington Post columnist, author, and commentator, Mr. George Will. As we look at where we are in the country, it seems that we've lost this ability to think deeply. We have instant certainty that prevails on whatever the topic of the day is. There doesn't seem to be any nuance. How do we get back to a different kind of conversation, an elevated dialogue when it comes to our national politics?
There's no substitute for the simple, obvious answer. We have to change the kind of people we're putting in our highest offices. I'll give you an example. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, who has a brawl a day with Disney or someone else, is now in a brawl against Bud Light. Trying to imagine Dwight Eisenhower or John Kennedy taking time from their busy schedules and the dignity of their offices to cuff around and box the ears of a beer company. I mean, this country has serious problems. Bud Light isn't one of them. So we just have to get, I know this sounds banal, but it's true. We have to get a more serious cohort of people in high office.
Yeah, we get past the performative politics, I think, is a big piece of that. And Mr. One of the things that you've done for almost 5 decades now is write every week. And it seems that we've lost that ability to write deeply, which prevents us from thinking deeply. I'm one of those who believes you don't know what you really think until you write it down. How do we get away from just the tweet, the quick hit, the instant certainty of the take, and get back to a more contemplative kind of view of where we are as a nation?
Well, I've never tweeted. I don't know how to tweet. I'm told I have a Facebook page, but I've never seen it. I write 100 columns a year, 750 words apiece. You can do an awful lot in 750 words. You can't do an awful lot in 240 characters except be enraged. Social media, by its very brevity and its instantaneous distribution, encourages extremism, vituperation, and rage. So if people would do what reading requires attention. It requires sustained attention. It requires something more than a few characters attention span. So we have to get people back to this. We have to get them to turn off talk radio, shut down cable television. The good news, Boyd, is that there are 333 million people in this country, and at any given moment, 325 million of them are not watching cable television, and they're not listening to talk radio. They're getting on with life, which is why we can isolate and quarantine the fanatical fringe.
Yeah, that's such an important part of that. And getting back to the things that do matter most, I know you have a bit of an affinity for baseball, and you've spent a lot of your career talking about things that we should conserve in our constitutional republic. And you've written this year in particular with some of the changes to baseball, how change actually can be part of a good conservation project.
There's no question. If you want things to stay the same, you have to change. People say, oh, gosh, they're changing baseball. No. What they've done is by banning the shifts, by forcing the action to speed up, by getting batters to stay in the batter's box, which the pitch clock does, what they have done is restore baseball as we knew it when we fell in love with it in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's in recent decades when baseball slowed down and surrendered to the three true outcomes: a strikeout, a home run, or a walk. That's when baseball changed. And this is not change, this is restoration, a good conservative aspiration.
Yeah, I think that's such an important part of the program there. And as you've watched our politics over the decades, there's obviously a lot to be pessimistic about when it comes to our politics. But what is it that actually gives you hope for the future of this country?
First, no one ever got rich betting against the United States. We are so good at creating wealth that not even the government can stop us with it. We have an industrious population, educated population. We got 7 of the 10 greatest world universities and their wonderful research and development energy that they infuse into the country. The United States still has, with its continental market, a kind of economic muscle that no one else in the world. Just look at the European Union, which has more people, but not nearly the dynamism. Furthermore, the bad news is that in recent years, we've seen the power of one man to change the tone of the country for the worse. I think the flip side of that is, okay, let's get a better person to change the tone of the country for the better. I think that's going to happen.
Yeah, and finally, Mr. Will, what's the one thing that we're not thinking about or that we're not talking about in the country that's been on your mind, kind of that under the radar thing that maybe could change that course just a little bit?
Well, I'll give you 2 things. Wonderful things are going to happen in the next 10, 20 years from molecular biology. We are going to eliminate entire classes of disease. Now, that's going to be a problem because we're going to extend life. Longevity is a great social achievement. We've made wondrous achievements in that, and we're going to make bigger ones because of DNA and all the rest. It's going to put additional pressure on the entitlement systems. But still, it's just a sign of the fact that progress in America is real and stunningly dramatic. We're so used to it, we sometimes don't even notice it. But things are getting better in the United States.
Fantastic. George Will, legendary Washington Post columnist, someone that I look to for deep thought and a different perspective on a regular basis. Mr. Will, thanks so much for joining us on Sunday Edition today.
Glad to be with you.
When we come back, we'll chat with former co-CEO of Chipotle, Monty Moran, for lessons in one-on-one leadership, creating culture, and sustaining excellence on Sunday Edition. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sunday Edition. Monty Moran is one of America's most admired business leaders. The former co-CEO of Chipotle Mexican Grill, he helped build the culture that took the company from a regional burrito chain to a Fortune 500 superstar. In his new book, No One is a Stranger, Monty shares his secrets for leading an extraordinary life through extraordinary relationships. Monty, welcome to Sunday Edition.
Hey, thanks a lot, Boyd. It's great to be here.
So as you look at how you went through this process, again, starting as a little burrito shop to a Fortune 500 company, give us a little sense in terms of the kind of culture. We always say culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think you actually live that and actually achieve that.
Yeah, I think somewhere, Boyd, along the way, I figured out, probably when I was at my law firm building that culture before moving over to Chipotle, I figured out that it's a lot more powerful and a lot more satisfying to become someone who can make others better rather than to focus only on making yourself better. That took me a while, but once I figured that out, that was really sort of the foundation by which I led Chipotle.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things, and this is in your new book, you had a really specific strategy. We talk about the importance of one-on-one. You took that to an entirely different level. Describe that for us.
Yeah, I think you can't lead someone unless you know them, period. And so at Chipotle, I took that very seriously. And so during my time at Chipotle, I spent, thousands of hours interviewing more than 25,000 people one-on-one in each and every one of our restaurants that I'd go to. So I had a practice of going to restaurants throughout the week. And when I was at those restaurants, I interviewed every single person one-on-one who was there. And I just got to know who they were and spent some time with them and tried to form a connection with them. And it wasn't specifically about any one thing. It was just trying to really get to know the people who worked at our company. And by doing that, I learned who they were, what kind of leadership worked and didn't work, what they liked about the stores and didn't like, what kind of customer experiences they were having, what their leaders were like and what was working and perhaps what was not working. And also a lot about the actual physical plant of the restaurant, what designs were best for them, which equipment worked best, and just learned absolutely everything at a very detailed level about what they were going through. And that made it much easier to lead them, because the only source of a leader's power, Boyd, is that other people choose to follow. You can't make them follow you. That's management. So if you want to lead someone, you better know them to understand what it is that lights them up and really makes them come alive and causes them to be at their very best.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that just a little bit because this was not just a simple, saying hi in the hallway to the employees. No. You had a very specific practice that I think really gave dignity to those conversations. Share that with us.
Yeah, I mean, I just, I really care about people. It's just something I really care about them. And I'm very curious to learn about people. And I don't tend to look at someone as being more important if they're the president of the United States than I look at someone who would be perhaps on their first day in the job at Dairy Queen, where I used to work, or at Chipotle. And so when I meet someone, I really am curious about them and want to get to know them. And curiosity is a really powerful tool, Boyd, because when you're curious about someone, it shows that you really care about them, that you really want to get to know them. And when you start asking them questions, those questions, in a small way, or actually maybe even a big way, promote that person for that moment to be your teacher. So you're subordinating yourself because you're really wanting to learn from that person. And when you learn, when you want to learn from someone, that's a very flattering thing to someone else, very empowering to someone else. And then they realize how much you really care about them. And when someone feels that you care about them, boy, oh boy, do they feel like they want to give their very, very best because they know that they matter, not just the job they're doing for you, but who they are as an individual. And that was really, I think, I guess the DISC operating system behind my leadership style, you might say.
Yeah, and I love that. And I love the fact that you made all of those sit-down meetings. Again, not just a stand-up thing, but a real specific sit-down. And even the title of your new book, No More Strangers, that's an interesting thing for a leadership book, but I think it speaks to this longing for belonging, this craving for connection that we have in society today. Tell us why that's so critical.
Well, the only way you can have an extraordinary life, Boyd, is to have extraordinary relationships, period. You can't have an extraordinary life without them. And yet most of us don't think enough about what does it take to have an extraordinary relationship. And the thing that it requires is having a really, really great connection with somebody. And it turns out that there are a whole bunch of things that each of us confronts that limit our ability to have a great connection with other people. And I talk about that in No One is a Stranger. In fact, I couldn't even come up with a title for the book. I wrote the whole book without knowing what the title was. And I was reading through it again. And there's a line in my book where I said, no one is a stranger to me, because to me, everyone is an opportunity to have another connection. Everyone is another opportunity to experience the love that comes between any two people who are both open to each other to experience sort of the commonality of the human experience. And so in the book, I really try to lay out for people how you can have much deeper connections with other people, what things tend to get in the way of those connections, such as ego and dysfunction and the lenses we carry and our own biases and assumptions. And by going through those and highlighting those, I really try to strip that stuff away so that people can learn to connect in a much more deep, authentic, and enriching way, which brings out each other's brilliance. And that's exactly what you do as a leader too, of course.
Yeah, such an important conversation, such a vital thing for all of us.
Yeah.
Just 30 seconds, give us a quick look. You know, this idea of a love-centered, stewardship-specific approach to leadership is not what we hear coming out of Washington in a lot of boardrooms. Give us a 30-second answers to that.
Well, you know, it's funny. People all assume that love belongs with your husband and wife or your partner or your boyfriend or girlfriend or your kids or your aunts and uncles and your grandparents, even your country. I love the United States, you know, or your state. Boy, I love Colorado, which is where I live, you know, but we somehow think that love doesn't belong in the boardroom or love doesn't belong when it comes to business. It's just business, nothing personal. Well, the truth is business is absolutely personal. It has to do with how you make a living. It has to do with, you know, products or services that you're buying, you're spending your hard-earned money on. So business is incredibly personal. And so love belongs in business just as much as it belongs in, you know, in a family scenario. You know, in fact, businesses are groups of people, and people need to be seen, valued, loved, and understood, just like people at home.
Yeah, fantastic. Great stuff as always, Monty Moran. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Boyd. Great to be with you.
And a special thanks to our Washington Post columnist George Will and Monty Moran, former co-CEO of Chipotle, for sharing important insights for conserving the principles of the past while imagining a better, brighter future. You know, for years I've warned individual, organizational leaders, and government officials that they're most likely to run out of energy before they run out of opportunity. Sociologist Elise Boulding said it this way: if one is mentally out of breath all the time from dealing with the present, there's no energy left for imagining the future. You see, there's a type of exhaustion that comes from constantly being out of breath over the present that inhibits deep, forward-looking thinking. National media that breathlessly reports on every angry, angst-filled, divisive political comment simply cannot create space for citizens to imagine the future. Politicians on both sides of the aisle who breathlessly strive to create social media moments try to propel their popularity. They can't focus on the future generations as well. So we have to change the game. If we want to imagine the future, we got to be present for the right conversation. Thanks for joining us on Sunday Edition. I am Boyd Matheson. And as always, as you go out into the world today, make sure you see something that inspires, say something that uplifts, and do something that makes a difference. Music and the spoken word is next.